Okay, so the next session that we're doing today, I hope everybody had a good lunch. We pumped you up with some sugar for dessert, so hopefully that'll keep you awake during this session, at least for maybe about the first hour. But we're just going to continue on some of the discussions that took on this morning, but we're going to really focus it in on our partners and the partners with North American Spinal Cord Injury Consortium. And how do we define partners? Okay, partners are either, they could be a lot of different things. So it could be representatives from industry, it could be research hospitals, it could be care hospitals, it could be pharmaceutical companies, or it could be lots of different things. But for the most part, these are organizations that are stakeholders within our spinal cord injury community, but they might not be living with the condition, or they don't directly represent. Yeah, thank you, Kim. Yes, so partner members are not just organizations. It could be people that are invested in the spinal cord injury community that are not directly related to spinal cord injury. So what do I mean by that? I mean, it could be an individual researcher. It could be an individual representative from an industry. But what is a patron member is somebody living with the condition, or a caregiver or care partner or family member. And then a principal member is a nonprofit organization directly representing people with spinal cord injury. And then our partner members kind of fall into all of that other bucket, but people that are stakeholders within our community. So what do we have today? To start off this session, we have a partner panel. So we have 4 members here. We have Dennis Berbeau from the FES Center, Lisa Lombardo from APT, John Genzel from Scope, and Shelley from Scowork. Scoburg, I forgot. Okay, Kentucky, gotcha. And Shelley from DP Clinical. So I'd like each of you to introduce yourselves and talk just briefly about your engagement in the research process. Dennis?
So I'm Dennis, thank you. I'm here in Cleveland in the FES Center. I have appointments at Metro Health Medical Center and at the VA hospital here. My area of focus is in neurostimulation approaches for bladder and bowel health after spinal cord injury. I do experiments in animals and with individuals with SCI. So I run that part of the translation spectrum, and I have an interest in trying to get these systems to the clinic and engaging in that process. But most of my effort has been in the research side of that, and especially the translation.
My name's Lisa. As Jen said, I work at the APT Center, which is a center of excellence at the VA hospital. I have an appointment at the VA and Metro, like Dennis. I am a physical therapist by background, so I work on all the clinical trials and the trials that we do at the VA and at Metro, working with the subjects who have received an implanted device. It's a neurostimulator for standing, stepping, or trunk control. Those are the areas that we focus on in our research. We've kind of taken a special interest recently with working on adapted exercise. So we've adapted a recumbent bike and used that with our stimulation system. We have about 12 people with those recumbent bikes at home that are part of our research. We've also worked on adapted rowing. So as a physical therapist, that's really important to me to get individuals with spinal cord injury active and engaged in the community and able to exercise again.
My name is John Genzel, so I'm here as a member of SCOBERC, the Spinal Cord and Brain Injury Research Center at the University of Kentucky in Lexington. We're a university-sponsored and a state-sponsored research center that focuses primarily on basic science research. I'm an associate professor at the University of Kentucky. So Kentucky is one of the states that has dedicated funds coming from traffic tickets that support research in traumatic brain or spinal cord injury. And we are the center that receives that money at the university. My research is focused on the basic science end of things. I currently, do almost all my work in rodent models of spinal cord injury, and our center is focused on a wide variety of things, mostly focused more so on some of the acute neuroprotective type therapy and research. But we do have some other research depending on who it is. Sasha Rabchevsky is part of our research group as well. He's done more chronic, research work, but we're primarily basic science research center.
Hi, everyone. I'm Shelley. I'm with DP Clinical, and I've been working with DP Clinical for 17 years, specifically on spinal cord injury related clinical trials. Our CEO of our company, Devinder Punian, had a vision, I guess, quite a few years ago. About 20 years ago, she started working on the SIGEN trial, and many of you know that the data from the SIGEN trial is still cured today, and they still go to that database. It was probably the largest SCI acute clinical trial done to date, enrolling 795 patients. But since then, we've worked on spinal cord injury trials every year, every couple years, every time there's new trials. We became somewhat of, we would like to call ourselves experts in managing clinical trials. And that means that we are not the scientists, we're not the MDs behind the protocols. My job as the assistant director of our SCI program is to make sure that I have a team in place that is very well versed on all things clinical trials. They understand the assessments, they understand what they're looking for when they're monitoring the medical charts and the medical records for these patients. So we are a CRO that manages clinical trials, both pharma and pharma, device, biologics, all areas.
Great, thanks, Shelley. Why don't you hold on to that microphone for a second? So the way we're going to run this kind of partner panel is to really kind of dig into a couple of key questions to address to you, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So some of the ideas or some of the comments that you might have once we get through some of our kind of key questions. So Shelley, I want to start with you. We've been talking this morning about, patient-centered research and engagement initiatives. And there's a lot of that going on in a lot of different conditions and a lot of different diseases, what we call pan disease. But if we want to focus in on spinal cord injury specifically in our community, what can we do? What can our community do to help you when it comes to your trials and the research that's going on?
Well, I want to look at my notes because I heard a couple really good statements this morning. Somebody mentioned that DOD having a consumer advocacy as part of their research team. I thought that was really interesting. By the time the clinical trials come to us, the protocol is typically already written. On occasion, we do have input in protocol development. It just depends on where the sponsor, the pharma company is in their spectrum of development and where their need. We're multifaceted, so they can come to us for data management, they can come to us for biostatistics, protocol development, the regulatory pathway. But truly in the last couple trials that have come our way, protocols for us to manage, I did not see any indication where there was any consumer advocacy. And I don't know, and that's where I struggle. When these pharma companies are coming to submit to the FDA, who tells them that they need to do this or that they should do this? I know in many grants, when you're doing basic research, you have to include that in your grants, but for phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials, where is that? And that's what I struggle with. By the time it comes to us, it's almost too late. Almost too late,
so we need to go up the pipeline, if you will. Is that what you're saying?
Right, or is it something that the FDA needs to demand before these companies can submit? Have you included patient feedback or people living with the injury? Have you included them in your plans to run this clinical trial?
That's interesting that you say that. To dovetail that's what the FDA is starting to do, is that's part of their patient and care partner program, is starting to look at, if whether it's right now that's on the device side, but on the device side that you need to have some type of patient engagement before you start submitting to the FDA. So they're starting to talk in the pre-submission stages, but it sounds like you're saying that by the time the protocol is approved, how can I have an influence on
Right.
it? Okay. John, what do you think?
You know, I guess where I see some of the gaps in the work that I do, and I'm not doing clinical trial work, you know, is that I feel like maybe, I don't know if this is for this group as much as the infrastructure for grant funding, which is what drives what we do for research on, is created by basic science researchers. It's our intellectual, you know, ideas that then we submit to basic science researchers that then decide what to fund. And so I think that there are times where there are really interesting questions that we like to think about that we then fund that may not really be that relevant to either what can be implemented from a clinical perspective or what is important from a consumer perspective. And so, and I don't know how to bridge that gap necessarily. There are things that I'm doing in my own interest, and part of it's just being here, and that, you know, that's driven by my personal desire to not necessarily be doing the same thing in 20 years from now. But you know, I think there's some movements with the SCI 2020 that to try to disrupt that and kind of may get researchers thinking more about sort of why we're doing this research and where we want the impact to fall. But I think there is a little bit of a disconnect there. And in terms of, it's very easy. I can sit in my lab and think of ideas and review grants and never interact with anyone in the community and have a very, very successful and long-lived research life.
So that's interesting that you bring that up, John, because that's been one of these things where we have a lot of researchers that are on the early stage that have never interacted with our community. So let me ask this question. So as you're looking and coming up with ideas for what's the next phase of research, are you ever looking at patient preferences?
Yeah, so I'm trying. I mean, and part of it is to get involved in these things. You know, we hear things, I think, from the basic science perspective of, oh, you know, improved bladder care and bowel care. And so, but it's very easy for some reason for me to look at that, you know, look at that word map that was put up or whatever and say, oh, bladder function. Okay, we need to study bladder function. Great, I'm going to implement this outcome for bladder. But then someone brought up the question of, well, what is it about bladder dysfunction that is important for someone with spinal cord injury? Is it incontinence? Is it, you know, is it retention? These are things I don't even think about as much as like, what's an outcome we can do for bladder? Good, we'll test that in our function. So I think that there's room for clinically informed basic science research. And I think that's where the impact can happen. I don't necessarily know, I mean, the responsibility falls on the researchers, I guess, to do that, but maybe, I don't know. I don't know. I think that's one way to move stuff forward. And I'm not sure where the motivation comes from that will fuel the energy for that to take place, right? Mm-hmm. I don't know. I mean, Sasha might have a different perspective too, as someone who's sort of bridging both sides of things a little bit more. But I think that we're starting to see a little bit more involvement of basic science researchers in conferences more like this, right? In the Asia meetings and stuff like that. There's been you know, I've been doing this for a long time, and we've gone to a lot of meetings where it's all basic science researchers talking all about spinal cord injury and how we need to push the field forward. And I think that now the lines are starting to merge and we're getting some more crosstalk. So it may kind of continue to happen, not organically, but the momentum may already be beginning. I'm not sure.
Great.
So I come from basically the opposite end of John. I'm more involved in human trials. Well, I should say only involved in human trials. And I think that kind of going along what he said is knowing what the SCI community, what do you guys see as the gaps in the current research that we're doing, and where can we be better? You know, we're doing things that directly impact humans, but I'm sure that we fall short. And where do you guys see those shortcomings, and how can we improve upon that? How can we make, you know, this research, we need to take it to the next step. It's research, and we need to translate that into something beyond just research. So where do you see that going, and what aspects of the research that we're working on are the most important, and where should we focus the energy to translation? And we all know, you know, we've all read Kim Anderson's paper, you know, what's the most important priorities after spinal cord injury. And I guess I would be interested to know over time and as things have progressed in spinal cord care, have those priorities changed at all? And are the priorities the same, or are they different now? and where should we be focusing our attention.
So you're saying looking at patient preferences, but over a period of time, like a longitudinal study, maybe similar to what they do for Parkinson's disease.
Yeah, because the care has changed and there's been hopefully some improvements in some of the care. So have those priorities now become different?
Great, thanks. Dennis, your thoughts?
I've got a lot of thoughts on this.
Oh yeah,
All right, I'll try to be
not
brief.
too much.
Yes, I'll try to be brief. Okay, so there is a lot of opportunity for individuals with SCI to have an impact. I loved that the work that Anita and John have been doing, and that graphic that was up earlier, that cycle of research. So I do some work with animals, and that's this preclinical stuff. And when I'm in that lab in those experiments, I could be cycling through discovery and have several different trajectories I could take that work. And I want to make sure that I maintain a priority of what's going to have, that I prioritize that work that's going to have an impact for individuals with SCI. So even at the preclinical phase, there's an opportunity to come in and just be that voice on this shoulder that says, okay, was that decision the thing that's going to help us down the line? Is that going to go the thing that's going toward translation? And then later on, down toward translation, being a member of the research team, not just a study participant. So when we do our research projects, and I know that a lot of us will treat the study participant as a member of the team while we're doing that experiment. We are actively seeking their input throughout the course of the experiment, but that's with the data collection component. So in our group, we've proactively recruited two individuals with spinal cord injury to our research team so they can have a hand in the study design and the protocol, in data acquisition and analysis and interpretation. And so I can realize that there's a couple of challenges there. So we have two people that hopefully they don't feel like they're representing a whole community, the hundreds of thousands of individuals with SCI. That's not what they're supposed to do, but they're supposed to make sure that they're providing that perspective, which is very important. And then when we're looking for the bigger picture, we can come to NASCIC or some of these other groups, which we've also been doing. So we've worked with individuals and advisory teams to project with NASCIC and put out a survey tool. So there's a number of ways where there are opportunities for individuals that to come into the research. We have examples where we've done that or we're working on it, but these are, right now they feel like one-off examples, right? And so if we have researchers and clinicians coming to each other's meetings and to your meetings, that helps. If you come to their meetings, that helps. If you know that there are research projects happening in your area, you don't have to be a study participant, but you can get to know the folks that are conducting that work and kind of insert yourself. And that can be intimidating, it can be difficult, especially if they don't get it, you have to educate them. But if you find even that one friendly person that's going to pull you in a little bit, and that helps immensely with writing a better grant. I review grants, and if I see that if I see a team of people and they're talking about some new rehab technology they're developing, and I'm looking at this thing thinking they've never actually talked to a physical therapist in their life, and they don't understand the burden and how this is going to, how this is actually going to get implemented. They don't have that vision, and or maybe they don't understand the person with lived experience. And I could talk to just five people with spinal cord injury and realize that there are some weaknesses here they haven't thought of. And so as a reviewer, I want to put in that, well, if you get some feedback here from someone that might actually use this system, that could really help you out in this project. So at all levels, there are opportunities. It makes us a lot better at disseminating our knowledge, at communicating. If I go to a group and I use the word neuromodulation and everyone, their eyes glaze over, well, you guys can help me do a better job at educating and explaining what I really mean by that.
Well, that's an academic loaded question on what is neuromodulation, but we'll get into that another time.
Yeah, we don't know what that means either.
We don't, yeah, the whole industry doesn't know exactly what it means anyway. But so there's a lot of good ideas here about going back to funding, about more engagement, about really looking at some of the clinically meaningful outcomes that you're looking for, even going back to basic science. But We've been talking a lot about patient engagement, and one of the things that is across all conditions, it's not just spinal cord injuries, how do we value that engagement? So how would you value that engagement? And even a more pointed question is, are you willing to pay for it? Are you willing to pay to get access to that patient community? So if you guys can give us our thoughts on that as well.
So real quick, I'm paying consultation fees to the people that are on my research team that they may not be employed by institutions, so I pay them a consultation fee. One person is incidentally employed, but they're not a researcher, so I pay them as staff. So yeah, we build that into the budget of the grant. So we plan ahead, it goes in the budget. But, and I'm glad Kim brought this up, there's a challenge with compensation. We have someone that it's very difficult to pay them because it can affect their financial situation. And then, so this person said, I cannot take money. And so we're trying to get clever about figuring out other ways to compensate them in good faith. And then there are simple things like focus groups. So that's something that we definitely can build that into a grant. We can do that, and we should.
So for the rest of you all on the panel, the understanding what the value is of patient engagement, but how do you measure that? Because so much, particularly when you deal with industry, they want to see an ROI on that. So if I'm going to spend money on patient engagement, how do I get my return on investment on that? Do you have any thoughts in terms of valuing? How do you value it?
Sure. So to answer your first question, yes, I think that there's mechanisms to pay, and that's not an issue for me at all. For me, if I want to be completely honest about whether it's payoff, one way would be is if I get grants. If including patient involvement increases my success rate as getting funding to do the research, then that would be a very objective and first line and selfish probably, but measure of success, and then we could move forward from there about how that research impacts things. But a very notable one would be if my grants get funded when I involve patients, then that's a first measure of success, and then the implementation of that success is a little bit probably more abstract.
Mm-hmm.
And again, from my perspective, we don't engage patients unless they're going to enroll in our clinical trial. And that's the ultimate goal, is to get as many patients enrolled as possible to meet our sponsors' timelines and to meet the enrollment goal as quickly as possible because of the sheer amount of money that it takes to run a clinical trial. So the only time that I've had experience involving spinal cord injured patients outside of a clinical trial is when we use them to help us do training. And somebody alluded, one of Kim's slides earlier was how do we compensate them? We do that through gift cards, again, because of the financial situations and things. But if we do engage them for anything outside of a clinical trial, that's our way of compensating, is through gift cards.
Could you explain the engagement of training and what perspective are you engaging people in the training?
We do a lot of training. I now have started a committee through Asia where we are providing NASCI training, NASCI, Ashworth, SCIM3, QT, training for the investigative sites, for assessors. We're expanding out into institutions and not limiting it just to clinical trials. It started very small, and it has grown exponentially just because we didn't realize there was such a need out there that so many people would need to be trained. But when we go train assessors or physical therapists or residents on how to perform the NASCI exam, the international standards, we always engage people living with spinal cord injury as participants in our practicum portion of it. It makes a huge difference when you're teaching somebody how to do the assessment on somebody who is living with a spinal cord injury versus an able-bodied person. It makes a huge difference. We even have people that we call them lifelong volunteers because they love coming and helping us teach, basically. So with those people, we compensate them again with gift cards.
Okay, great. Lisa?
So as Dennis mentioned, we also do build in compensation for our research participants, and that does pose challenges because they get money directly from the federal government and it shows up on their taxes. You can't really hide that. So that is a challenge that I think we need to overcome. And then going along with what John said is, if having the SCI community involved in your projects, if that would help with funding, then it would certainly be a motivational factor for everybody to do that. And perhaps we need to educate the funding agencies that how important it is to engage the SCI community in our research, and that they would build that in as something that was required and necessary so that everybody did that.
So if I can open that up for the other partner members in the room. But before we open it up, I did want Matt Bellman from Mylan, if you could talk a little bit about the incentives that they used in the Toyota Challenge. I think that'll brought some new light into this topic.
Yeah, just some interesting anecdotes along those lines. For those in the room that don't know me, I'm Matt Bellman. I'm the founder and chief technology officer of Mylan. We make FES and rehab robotics devices. And my company, along with the Florida Institute for Human and Machine Cognition, IHMC, we're partnered and we're finalists in the Toyota Mobility Foundation's Mobility Unlimited Challenge. I have to say it that way. It's a lot of syllables, but and that challenge was organized very well. And the objective of the challenge is to revolutionize mobility for people with lower limb paralysis. It's funded by Toyota's Mobility Foundation, which is one of their nonprofit arms. And the way that challenge was set up is you had to present a concept for meeting that challenge of revolutionizing mobility for people with lower limb paralysis. But along with, so the deliverables for the challenge are a prototype to demonstrate that you can address this challenge. But along with the prototype is a business plan as a deliverable. So right now with this challenge, IHMC is delivering the prototype. We're trying to figure out the business plan side of things, but it's really important because they've made it an essential piece of the puzzle to have a well-defined plan for, okay, if you can figure out how to make the device or figure this thing out, how are you going to actually get it to people? And then the other piece of that they mandated was participation by people in the community. So people with lower limb paralysis have to be participants. And that was from the very earliest stages of the competition and the first applications and everything, that you had to, say how many people on your team have lower limb paralysis, or who have you talked to, and what's the feedback that you've gotten. And you have to continue to demonstrate that throughout the project so that you don't end up building something that nobody needs, which is a problem in the robotics industry in general. But it's been, again, that challenge, the way that's set up is it's really well done. And I don't know if other funding agencies should adopt that kind of model, or if we can hold ourselves accountable to implementing that kind of model. But it's central to a theme at Toyota, which is Genchi Genbutsu, which is Japanese for go and see. And so they really understand the importance, and what that means is go, if you're talking about developing something for somebody who's paralyzed to use at home, you need to go to their home and you need to be in their home and watching and learning and talking with them. So they get it. Maybe other people will get it too.
So that was a funding agency that actually put kind of those mandates forward. I think one of the interesting things about that model and how you ran it, could you just kind of give us a brief overview of the focus group that you ran? Because it was structured a little bit differently than most focus groups.
Yeah, and so because of those mandates and because of the way that we do our own product development at Mylan, we know that user needs are the most important piece of the whole puzzle, and clearly understanding them and clearly defining them. So what we did with the Toyota Challenge, the first part of it was they give you $50,000 to develop your final application. And we used all of that money to bring together people in a room like this. So we invited a wide variety of people with lower limb paralysis. We invited clinicians from around the country. We already had tons of engineers between Mylan and IHMC, and then some other experts in kind of the industry, and got everybody together in a room and said, okay, here's our concept. So our concept for the Toyota Challenge is an exoskeleton that can replace the wheelchair one day as the primary means of mobility for people with lower limb paralysis. And we said, all right, that's the concept. What would that thing need to do? And well, we did it based on tasks. So we said, this thing is going to have to do, here's all the possible things that this thing could do. Can you help us figure out, okay, what's missing from that list? What's on that list that isn't important? And more importantly, can you help us prioritize that list? Because at the end of the day, we got to draw the line somewhere. We can't make something that does everything. And I see the way that you all have organized NASCIC in a similar kind of thing. Here's the thoughts. What's most important to you? That's awesome. So we did something like that, and then developed a list of basically functionality that the device needs to have, and it's prioritized. And now we can really go about developing in that way.
Great, thank you. Yeah. Any comments from any of the other partners in the room? But you will be by the end of today.
Definitely. I think like holding ourselves accountable, as you said, is something that we can do from a pharma perspective. We can show where we've had successes in getting the feedback, and what at least my company, and I think other pharma hates more than anything, is protocol amendments and study delays and problems with enrollment. So if you can show that you've made an impact on those criteria that have helped a trial be successful, and also just saying, this should be part of every single trial developments, early on get that feedback. So I think that we can do that, bring back our successes and make it across all of the clinical trials that we're designing.
Excellent, thank you. And I think we have a comment from our streaming online. To the back of the room, and then we'll go to Jane. Yeah.
We have a comment from Heather Gainforth. When thinking about the funding piece, we need to ensure we are supporting funders to create funding opportunities that allow for meaningful partnership rather than tokenism.
Good point. So where she's going is that it's not just one person that you're having sign on and give them their name when it comes to funding, but it's more of what type of engagement strategy do you have, and put that forward in the applications. Jane.
Jen, you mentioned earlier some research that had to be redone because they couldn't quite get the numbers, et cetera, the milking, and just wondering if we could collect some data on where money has been lost because of not engaging people up front. Might that be useful?
That's a really good point. I don't know of any study or data that exists in that perspective, but I can always go back to our contacts at Faster Cures and see if they have collected anything from other industries, other conditions, to see if we might be able to extrapolate to spinal cord injury. Good point. Any other comments? Yeah, Sasha.
So since John mentioned my name, I'll just pick up. So as a basic scientist, I do study models of chronic condition as well as acute at the same time. And so one of the incentives I heard was to be able to, if you knew that you were to write in a grant, that if you had somebody with living experience on your consult team, that you would probably get a better score. Well, the reality is that on the other end of that, well, to get that money, you're going to have to also ask for more money. Because you're now saying that you're going to translate within your own lab, and that's just not possible. How hard is it for us to translate stuff from bedside to bedside? How are you going to do it in one lab? So it is a little bit of a big leap to think that you can engage basic scientists. I'm just going to say it. I think that what is happening right now is what's been needed. And the fact that we're talking about this and we're going to train our trainees who are going to be carrying the torches, this will be standard status quo. It won't be like it has been for past 30 years. That's my experience. So I'm not terribly optimistic that within my lifetime things will happen, but I know that the next generation, and that's what I think we're all here for, is to bring that not tomorrow, but lay the foundation tomorrow that we can then build upon. And I know that's etheric, kind of outy, but I really do believe that the fact that we're talking about this, and especially in John and I's discussion, the youngsters, the young students coming in, when we had this session at Neurotrauma, teach us how to be advocates. They all asked us, the ones that were attending the luncheons, you want us to be, sure, we'll be advocates, teach us how. And we're, well, I don't know how, because we're just learning ourselves. Now that we have this impetus, we are going to lead by example. And by that, you hand a torch off, and not just, do we have to put in the thing about space? No, they're going to know. They have to. And not because they're forced to, because they understand the bigger picture.
So you're saying, Sasha, that that we, part of our advocacy effort should be going to the students and actually training the next generation? Oh,
yes.
What's this?
It's without a doubt.
Oh.
Without a doubt. Yes. Without a doubt, yes. Yes.
Couple of points I just want to make real quick. One, talking about the basic research and how engagement can help. You know, I think when you think about the translatability of that preclinical work, you know, you're talking about your trial and the 24-hour time window for a hyperacute trial. You know, still think that's a little tight, you know, but it's better than the 8-hour or 12-hour ones, which are, you know, having absolute nightmares recruiting, because nobody that has a spinal cord injury is ready to be in a trial at that point, and certainly they aren't capable of giving an informed consent. That's where we talk about community consent. But anyways, making sure that you've got that information in that preclinical stage will ensure that it's translatable to a clinical environment. Now, on the other point, when you talk about engagement, when you talk about budgets, you know, my organization funds research, and I've talked to a lot of funders about this, and I can tell you unequivocally, every funder I've ever spoken to says that a strong engagement plan that is appropriately budgeted for strengthens your grant. You know, just saying that you're going to do engagement, we're going to talk to these people, we're going to do that. Yeah, it sounds good, but it also sounds like tokenism. If you have created a budget that says, I'm going to spend this much money to do these activities, I'm going to reimburse my partners in this way at these levels based on that amount of experience, it shows that you've clearly thought it through, and it strengthens your grant. And every funder I've spoken to says that's an element of a grant proposal they would never cut. They would never reduce your budget based on your engagement activities. So budgeting appropriately and planning for engagement strengthens your grant, and it's probably not going to reduce your grant award.
So let me ask a question coming off of that, is that if it strengthens the grant proposal, but it's not in the requirements, right? So how do we get that, or how do we structure it so that it can be in the requirements of a grant application, if you will? So I think Kim Eisner from Nielsen Foundation had mentioned that the other day, is that they actually did that in their bladder and bowel portfolio.
So I work for a research organization, so we do a lot of funding in spinal cord injury. So I'm the program director, so I send all the RFPs and I get all these questions. And we do want patient involvement. How do we do that? So again, it comes to, there is not clarity on a lot of these people. That's something new to a lot of these researchers. We are trying to see how we can bring into basic research. Now I'll tell you, recently we had something in imaging studies. So it's a clear example. They say, what would patients can suggest in imaging studies in acute care? They can still be engaged in letting them know what is important to them to learn about that. So we have to, again, come up with something very concrete, what the students require, how we can engage them. Then we know, if we have a clear process and a clear document for all different kinds of communities, students, researchers, how can CROs can do it, how FDA has done it. So we don't say that CROs cannot do it or FDA should do it, not put it on others' shoulders and we can take it over. So I think it's a lot of going on, like, you know, Canada, they started patient-oriented research program. This was CHR, big signatories now, I think in 8 or 9 years. And they mandated, I sat on many of these review panels, that patients have to be part of this. And some did, some didn't, but it was required, not mandated. So until it is really mandated with a clear-cut budget, these things do not happen. And even sometimes the budgets are there, when you read the reports come in, you don't see that it's really happening. You might say it's happening, but it's not happening. So I think developing something, a clear processes of doing this for different stakeholders will help this move forward.
Jane and then Kim.
Where?
Jane, yep.
Oh, I'm sorry. So when it's not happening, are there repercussions? Sorry. When it's not happening, so it's been on the budget, but it didn't happen in reality, are there repercussions?
Oh, let her have the microphone, because so then our folks online can hear.
Hello?
Yeah, we heard you, Jane. But Tara's response, we wanted to hear it in the microphone. Yeah.
So like I said, it's required, but it's not mandatory. I can't decline a proposal because there was no consumer involvement, but I would really like to see it, but it's not mandated. There's no point system which are taken away if there's no consumer involvement.
So part of an advocacy effort, potentially. I think the next one is Kim.
The National Institute on Disability and Independent Living Research, which is a federal funding organization, they have they've required consumer engagement for a long time on their grants, and there are quite a few investigators that are really good at writing in an advisory board in that grant system, and then that turns out this is a lot of tokenism has happened that way. And so they write it in really well, and it sells the reviewers, but then they don't even do anything. They don't even meet with the advisory board. And there are no repercussions to that from that agency. So that is something that should be corrected. But what I can say is that the PCORI Institute has developed really, really good guidelines on how to write meaningful engagement. And so they're from a funding agency. And they mandate these sections have to include this, 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 and this. And it's part of the reporting at the end. And so there are ways that funders can come up with language that is effective for that.
So a lot of what I'm hearing in the themes of this is that the systemic change isn't going to happen until we start to mandate it from a funding perspective. But I have another comment here by Matthew.
This is going to be a little folksy, and I hope it makes sense. And I have to preface by asking you to indulge me. When I walked in the room this morning, I have this sort of theory that there's 3 kinds of people in the world. As I'm listening to the conversation, it just changed to 4. But I think, I don't know, maybe it's instructive, maybe it's not. I think there are the 3 kinds of people when I came in the room this morning there's those people who believe that the system, and let's talk about the research system, it works. You seem to have the right people in charge, and maybe you just have to have a person with an SCI on your grant. The system works, you just have to have the right people in the right place. Then there's the next group of people that think the system doesn't work and needs to be transformed. And then third group of people don't care. They just want to do what they're going to do and tell me what I have to do, and I'll do it. The fourth group, and I think this is where the conversation to me, is the fourth group are the people that think the system needs to be transformed, but whatever you transform today has to be transformed tomorrow. And so there has to be a roadmap, but there has to be a roadmap that's flexible, and tomorrow we realize, oh, that road's closed and this road's open, and that road used to be there and now it's a cornfield, that we have to adjust constantly, because otherwise we end up in some form of entropy and it's not working anymore, and it lends itself to the people who don't care and just tell me what to do. I don't know if that is helpful or not, but it's been running through my mind.
So what type of person are you?
What,
Where do you fall, Matthew?
Well, I'm definitely that the system doesn't work and needs to be transformed. I'm increasingly recognizing the need for a flexible strategy, but also what's really important is to understand who it is that we're talking to, and who are those, which kind of person are you? So when we communicate to researchers, when we communicate to policymakers, when we communicate to clinicians, which one are you? So I know how to talk to you, and I know how to incentivize or appeal to you, because I think that's really, really important. Otherwise, like kind of came up at SCI 2020, you're using words, you might as well be speaking in a language that's never been heard before, because you're thinking of, you're defining everything differently.
Okay, Bill and then Megan. Mhm.
So my answer to you, Matthew, is combined new blood and the continual feedback loop of the consumers, because say we just solved a big problem in here and we're happy as heck driving or flying back home, we just solved this problem and we're pretty proud of it. Well, there's gonna be another problem tomorrow that's gonna morph. We're gonna have to, if we stay too proud of what we've accomplished over here, we're not seeing the next thing. We need somebody to tell us that. We do, with the United Spinal Resource Center, we do continual closed case surveying. We ask people every day what their experience was. And it's great to get nice testimonials. We hand them off to marketing, they do something with that, because it's great to have testimonials. But sometimes we get people say, you know, your 1 to 10 scale, I'm not above a 4. Wow. Now I got to call the guy. You know, well, what's the problem? Well, you know, I'm waiting for a response. I won't expect a response right away. Well, we thought we gave it to you. Well, it didn't get to them, so we had to go fix that. So unless we ask them what they're getting, too often Jane and I send stuff out in a cyberspace. We're not sure if they're even getting it, to go to the junk folder. So unless we have people tell us what we're doing wrong and kick us in the butt, we don't know how to fix the next problem. So I think, like, I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name with Myelin, but you know, yourself and everybody else who, like, spending all of the seed money you were given when you won the opportunity to get funding to advance your project, spend it all on asking people what they actually need. Nobody asked me what kind of wheelchair I need. Last time I went in with a 3-page typewritten bulleted list of exactly what I wanted, and I still didn't get it all. It's a fight to get what you need. Nobody's asking me what I need or what I want. So if you start there, you're gonna do all your work in the right direction. The iBot was a really neat thing. Couldn't use it. Wheelchair users that needed it couldn't use it. You know, Dean Kamen's a genius, but he built a really neat thing. He didn't ask anybody what they needed. And now hopefully iBot 2 will address some of those problems. So that's my answer to your conundrum.
Excellent. Mike.
Just really quickly, because one thing you said early on just echoed what Sasha said earlier about students. At SCI 2020, in my experience this last year, people under a certain age loved the response from our community, and people over a certain age didn't. The students that have been responsive, particularly at Work in the Walk, in our advocacy efforts, we've tried to get funding for PhD students and pre-med students. Hasn't been able to work, but our experience so often is that the younger folks see the need for change and want to be that change, Sasha, that you were describing, and it kind of fits into that equation.
Okay, I'll take issue with that, but we're going to bring the microphone over to Megan, because I think there are people over a certain age that totally believe in what we're doing. So I wouldn't stereotype all of us, Matthew. Megan, and then we have a question online. Yep.
So commenting, Matthew, on your categorization, you were saying that some people believe that the research system works, some people, believe it's broken. it's possible that that the whole research enterprise actually works, but only for 80% of the situation, and that certain groups fall through the cracks of the parts that aren't working. And the fear that I have about spinal cord injury community is that they keep falling through the cracks over and over again for these systems that otherwise work for other disease processes or research processes. And so if that's the case, then the system really is broken because the same people keep falling through the cracks. And so what it tells me is that incremental change and tweaking little systems and tweaking the ecosystem in small ways isn't actually going to help. That the system has to fundamentally be changed. And it's possible that the only way to do that is to say, we're the exception to all of your rules and you just need to treat it differently just because SCI, right? And maybe we can play around with this idea. Maybe it's too extreme, but maybe we could just play around with the idea that a lot of things have to change a lot in order to fix the problems that we're seeing.
Good comment. I think while the microphone's going to the back of the room for the online, I just wanted to, what we're learning and being engaged with so many different condition-based organizations, particularly through faster cures. Spinal cord injury is not the only condition that's dealing with this problem. So it's a systemic problem around a lot of conditions and diseases that are complex. And online, Devin?
Yeah, we have a comment from Heather Gainforth on the live stream. I think we need to be very careful about how mandating partnership and repercussions for not partnering are implemented. If our approach is too punitive, we run the risk of scaring or demotivating some groups to change who are worried that they cannot partner, in quotations, perfectly. If we are going to ask for change, we need to support groups to take chances and make mistakes in a supportive environment rather than becoming the partnering police, as we risk isolating the groups we need to change.
So a softer size rather than mandate. I think, John, let's bring it back up to the panel. Mm-hmm.
So I have a couple comments. I mean, one is just a perspective standpoint. So I am probably in the younger generation. The fact that I was fortunate throughout my career, I was involved in spinal cord injury training courses in basic science research and standardizing the field. And I've been doing that for, I started about 18 years ago that I was involved in the teaching of those things. So I think some of these, and for me, it influenced me because it was just exposure. So part of those training courses were having individuals with spinal cord injury come in and just talk about, the things that are important in their lives, the conditions that they have, and, the ideas of, bowel routines and those sort of things. Those have been in my mind since I started research. And I have realized that, some people in my lab have no idea that what the condition is like. And so I think some of these things come about, some of the change we're talking about could come about from just exposure, and exposure and involvement in two-way conversations. And that's something that Sasha sort of brought up. One sort of unfortunate part of this is those training courses are now coming to an end because the idea is that there's a critical mass of people who have been trained in spinal cord injury, and this field is pretty much standardized. And those people that have been trained can now go on and pass that on to the newer generation. But, I think it's really important that younger individuals or people getting into research have communication and interaction with individuals with the conditions they're studying, because it gives you an entirely different perspective. And so I do agree with Sasha too, that I think we will see momentum here, that I'm an optimist, if that's one of the categories. So that I think that the system, exposure may bring about improvements. The other thing I want to say is going to be extremely controversial, and I don't know how people feel about this, but I wonder sometimes, and I understand the failures of research to not improve spinal cord injury conditions and individuals living with spinal cord injury. As Kim brought up in SCI 2020, your life expectancy hasn't increased despite the fact that there's, millions and millions and billions of dollars going into spinal cord injury research. But I guess I would also like to say that you know, we're going to talk about FES is up here in neuromodulation, whatever that means, right? But all that's built on decades of basic science research that has now moved into clinical aspects, and there's a lot of research to be done there, but the proof of the efficacy is there, and now it's a matter of implementation and larger problems of healthcare and how do we get those things in. So I think that there are models of which certain things have advanced through basic science research and moved into translation. Another one is some of the stem cell work that, you know, is still controversial and ongoing in China. But Joe Springer, who's the director of Scope, just came back. He's part of the advisory panel there. And, you know, he's now seen the same individuals year after year having received some of these transplants. And it's still, you know, and there's some rehab involved there, and there's some quality control issues. But from my understanding from him, there's some improvements there that have been sort of unprecedented. And there's clinicians involved in that panel who are seeing things that haven't happened before. And again, that's sort of some examples of basic science research. I understand the pace isn't what people want. Of course it's not. And it's a very complex disease, but I don't know if it's entirely broken, but I think that, you know, if there is increased emphasis of research on areas that really matter, and I don't know why, as basic science researchers, we're caught up in this idea of locomotion, right? This is a big issue. So when we do our studies, you know, when we do our injury models, our number one outcome, and you can publish papers, is based purely on whether the rats and mice can walk better. And the reason why we haven't done, let's say, a bladder or bowel outcome, right? Which there's tons of therapies that are probably dying too in basic science research because it doesn't improve locomotor function, but for all we know, it could have increased bladder function, right? And why don't we implement that? And as growing up in the research field, my thing, what I heard was it's hard, right? It's hard to do. It's hard to actually train your people to do these locomotor tests. It takes 2 people. They have to be trained well. You have to, you know, it's a fairly easy test to run, but I'm not sure it's any harder to put animals in a metabolic cage and record bladder, you know, urine output. I mean, so I think that I don't think the system is entirely broken. I think there's some examples with lots of resources where things have moved and there's a lot more to be done, but some emphasis on some of these, shifting emphasis a little bit. And let's say if every study that had locomotion as an outcome was looking at bladder, we may uncover some things that improve bladder function that could really be kind of moved. Now, again, I'm an optimist in that stuff, and I understand, and I'm saying it controversial, and people can hammer me for it. But, you know, I think a little bit of exposure, maybe some slighter shifts, course corrections, are not going to improve things at the rate we want to by any means, but may still lead to at least better improvements than what we see now.
Thanks, John. I think Dennis, the bladder guy over here sitting next to me, is itching for that microphone.
Yeah, measuring bladder outcomes is easy, eh? So if you want to, I don't think it is actually. That's why I do it, because it's easy. No, so I'm being facetious. I want to respond to a couple of those things, largely in agreement, but with a slightly different take, because I go a little bit further on the translation spectrum with a lot of stuff. So I think that the system was kind of designed by and for researchers originally to do discovery science, and in that way it works pretty well. So you know, so the community has a role there, like I said, to be that voice over here that says, okay, why there's this discovery happening? Can we prioritize those things that might be channeled toward translation? Where the system starts getting frustrating for those of us in translation is that it feels like it doesn't meet a lot of the challenges that we get when we're going to translation, when we're going to de-risking for potential regulatory and reimbursement approval and coverage to something that might be marketable. When we're trying to work with other stakeholders like the clinicians in the medical delivery, the clinical delivery of this work. A lot of the frustration that you might be feeling is going to be a lot of the cross-stakeholder, some of the challenges that individual stakeholders have, including researchers, and we're focused on that right now. But also, you could have a whole panel just on medical care, you know, delivery of clinical care in these technologies, on commercialization, the challenges there. The funding agencies and what their challenges might be. So what role do you think you might have in, so do you feel like you understand the challenges that the researchers have just as much as we're trying to understand the challenges that you have? That's one question I have for the group. And another one is, what role do you think you have in helping address those challenges? And what role do you think we have in helping address those challenges?
So with that question, I'd like to hand it over to both Lisa and Shelley, because both of you work and interact with clinicians. I mean, Lisa, you've been a clinician before you got into research. So if we can get both of your perspectives. Lisa, go ahead.
So specifically answering Dennis's question, is that what you,
Mm-hmm.
okay. So what role can you repeat your question?
Sorry.
Yeah, go
Sorry,
ahead.
I had a lot of questions.
Let me say with that first.
All right.
So John brought up the point, about the locomotor studies, and it's kind of ironic that I'm going to speak on this and actually defend what he said, since I mostly work with movement. But if you think about it, anything that's ever put out on national television in regards to spinal cord injury is all about movement. It's all about getting somebody in an exoskeleton. It's all about epidural stimulation, allowing someone to stand, and it's all the sexy stuff that's researched. But nobody ever talks about the challenges of everyday living with an SCI and the fact that your bowel and bladder don't work. And they never do a story about how somebody with an SCI urinated on their own because of some research. Because they just don't talk about those kinds of things. It's all about the movement. And that's where I think, as the SCI community, it really needs to be brought to the forefront. What is the most important things on a day-to-day basis living with an SCI? What issues need to be addressed first and foremost in research? And how can we have the greatest impact on your day-to-day life? And sure, walking is great. And like I said, it sounds funny coming from me because that's what I do. I'm a physical therapist, but I also see the other side of it, all the challenges that go along with it and the need for those to be addressed.
Great, thank you. Well, you're handing the mic over to Shelley. I just wanted to make a quick comment on what you said, Lisa. One of the findings that we had from our SCI 2020 survey from the community is that they're really sick of the media hype. That hype that gets out there creates a lot of false hope and expectations that it's going to be out soon, but it never does. So I think us as a community as a whole, we have to be very cognizant of that. Go ahead, Shelley.
I just want to reply to John too, talking about locomotor function. And another just lived experience. Many years ago, we did an acute spinal cord injury study, and the study did not meet their primary outcome. So of course it's deemed a failure. They went to the FDA and primary outcome wasn't met. When the statisticians and the company started looking at all the data and calling through the data, it showed improvement in bladder function. So the company went back to the FDA, and the FDA told them, "You're fishing. You need to do another clinical trial with bladder outcomes as your primary outcome." Well, of course, the money wasn't there, but now, many years later, we see companies developing their protocols, and they're trying to throw everything in the kitchen sink into their protocol. And Dr. Parr used the analogy yesterday, throwing spaghetti against the wall to see what sticks. That's what it feels like some of these new companies are doing. And maybe as a result of that, try all these different things and see what shows improvement. But I thought that was a really interesting thing that, the FDA said, "No, you're fishing."
That's interesting from, our experience in the spinal cord stimulation world for pain. We know it works, but they don't always know the mechanisms of action. So sometimes things have to go back to basic science to understand what that mechanism of action is. So that's an interesting comment. But let's go back to, Dennis, you can keep this microphone for a second there, Shelley. Let's go back to Dennis's question about roles. And here's my kind of feedback for this that I wanted to bring to the panel. Is one of the problems that is the fact that we haven't clearly defined our roles? But if we do have a lot of clearly defined roles, is that just putting us back into a bunch of silos that doesn't make us work together? So help me in terms of, what we can do as a community. Is it a matter of defining our roles in the process, or better defining the process, or is it trying to break down those roles so that we can work more together as a community?
And explain it a little bit further, our roles pertaining to?
In the research process and the whole spectrum of bringing something from research to bedside.
Again, not being in the realm of basic science and getting the studies as at the point where we get them. Myself, our company looks for organizations like this that can facilitate that and can help that, how to get involved sooner in the decision-making process, and how to get the consumer advocacy in there, how to get somebody talking to the FDA to tell them you have to change your policies to make sponsors or pharma companies include them as you're building your product and as you're building your protocol and your research. I guess that would be my feedback on that.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Dennis? You asked the role question, or you want to take that, Lisa?
So I think there would need to be a change both in the process and in the identification of your role. I think as far as the process goes, we need to, as we've mentioned here today a lot, get the SCI community involved very early on in the development at the basic science level all the way through translation. We have the stage that I'm at in research is a lot different than John, but still, if we were going to take what we do now and translate it, are there aspects of what we're currently doing in our research that are not important for translation? So I think that, just the whole process and would need to be having the SCI community involved from day one. And then as far as roles go, really just taking a step back and not assuming the role that I'm a clinician, but I have to wear many different hats and not just be a clinician. So I think forgetting about your title or position and just making sure that you're being sensitive to all aspects.
Yeah, some good feedback. So, so I have an engineering background, and I liked what you were saying about Mylan's experience. And so, engineering 101 for an undergraduate, the first thing they do is they tell you you have to go to the user, get your design specifications. So we had a professor that gave us a design problem, and we were broken up into teams. And I won't spend a bunch of time going into this story, but it's funny, so ask me later. But only one of the teams actually went to the person to get the design specs. Everyone else just went to test designing based on the tools they had. And some of them were kind of solving the problem, some of them weren't. But then they were starting to get their feedback after they went and designed something. So so I think there's anyone with an engineering background should recognize a role when they're doing this research that they have to go to get the design specs. So they have to go to the individual's SCI. If they don't have that background, they need, and they're trying to go into translation, they're going to need to be told that that's part of their role. If they're trying to translate, they're trying to solve a problem, then they need to understand that problem. And I think that the next generation of researchers that are earnestly engaging in translation are going to be doing that, at least I hope, and that needs to be part of our training programs and expectations. I think the roles for individuals at SCI, I talked to my colleagues that predominantly focus on things with stroke rehabilitation. And I naively asked them, so what organizations do you go to get a good sense of what individuals with stroke need? And they report that that population of individuals are not nearly this well organized. They're not organized like this. And so I'm naive about that, but I take them at their word that you have an immense opportunity. And from what I understand, you're taking advantage of that, which is fantastic, by getting to understand what is the research process and understanding what that's like, and then how it works, what the challenges are, and so as you're doing that, you can think of what are some real ways you would insert yourself in those processes that are interesting to you, and we're seeing from Kim's presentation this morning that there are places where you have interest and priority and ways you might do that. So that's, I think you're already on the right track there, thinking about that. I'm going to stop there for now.
Let me ask a question to you, and this kind of goes back to both Kim and Barry's presentation this morning. So each one of you have a different kind of place in the whole research process, right? And as we're looking at capacity building, basically educating our community of how we can embed ourselves into the research process in each one of those phases, what would you like to see for people to be trained on, or the parts of our community to be engaged in your kind of in your sphere in the research process?
Do you mean in practical terms what we would like to see happening?
Yeah, so let's say we do go ahead and say, listen, Dennis, we're going to bring a team of people, of 5 people, to come
Brilliant.
to your lab and be engaged in your research to really embed and help inform you. What are the key things that you want them to know? What should we focus on when we're looking at building capacity amongst our community to help you?
So, I mean, the first thing I'm thinking about is where can I put you to work? So giving seminars, that we have someone in the back there, Hanan, that has shown up to give to educate our trainees, and we've had other individuals in the community with SCI that are local in Cleveland area that will come and give these. They'll educate trainees. That is a huge experience. So anything that we can do, this thing already came up to get researchers at all levels of their career, but especially the trainees and individuals, anyone with a grant, to get educated on what is the real perspective of the individual SCI. You can come into a room and answer any kind of question that they can think to ask. Sometimes the conversation gets very real very quickly. They'll be surprised. The first thing they'll see is the wheelchair, right? And you're all used to that, right? So, but you might be used to that with a lay audience. Now here are professionals that, want to do something that's going to be impactful. Well, you want to educate them on what your experience is. It's been a great opportunity. So a lot of that, and then if you can, I'm thinking specifically what in our realm, we have researchers and projects. How can we insert you into our teams very proactively? Could there be focus groups where we're pitching ideas? There's just the number of activities I can think of are immense, and the mind reels.
Okay, so what I hear is that you're saying, listen, if we look at capacity building, we can look at bringing in the community to help train and kind of educate your research team on, what are our real life experiences, as well as being a soundboard for some of those pitch ideas that you might have. So.
Yeah, and again, just to, not tokenism, but to be an active member in the research team.
Okay. Yep. Go ahead, Kim.
Okay. So you were talking about how informative it is for the group of people with spinal cord injuries to come in and educate your team, or to be a sounding board for your team. How important is it for the people that come into your, say, to help with your grant? Do they need to know human research regulations? Or if they were to come in with John, do they need to know animal research regulations?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that just having the exposure. So I echo everything Dennis said in terms of the type of involvement that would be really valuable for me and my research team is just getting involvement, understanding, because it's not necessarily a tangible outcome maybe in a month or two, but if people come in, especially trainees, but keeping me on board too, it's easy for me to be in my office and read papers and think, ooh, these things are really exciting, but when it is talking about bladder function or pain, we're getting involved in pain, like, well, what is, I can think of what we do with animals in pain, but you know, I would like advice. Is this, if I show you that I can make an animal's paw move differently, is that something that's going to encourage you as someone with a spinal cord injury that, yes, that's an effective pain therapy? No. Okay, well, let's talk about some other outcomes. What kind of pain? How do you sense pain? Can we do that in our animals? I don't think you need those sort of feedback. And the other thing would be valuable actually for me is I actually think it would, I share, you know, we like to talk. Researchers are, you know, we're pretty arrogant, right? Like, I mean, we think of ideas and we think we have the best ideas, but I actually think it would be valuable to also provide some insight into research and I would like to be, as much as having people come in and give perspective on our research, I would be happy to answer questions about the perspective that I'm taking on the research that's coming out. Because I think a lot of people, especially in the rehab hospital, someone mentioned that within that first year, you're learning about everything after injury. It's so confusing. There's so many papers. What does it all mean? Sure, ask questions. I can't guarantee I can answer them right, but I can at least give you perspective or say, hey, I don't know and I can look that up. But I think that kind of involvement early on could inform subsequent years down the line, educating the community about research, what it means and what our challenges are, and back and forth.
Yeah, I just want to get some feedback from Shelley and Lisa, and then we'll hand it to the audience in terms of looking at, again, looking at capacity building. What would you like to see from our community? What knowledge or what on to help you?
What I would like to see from my perspective in managing a clinical trial for a pharmaceutical company, time is money. We're always working on timelines, and timelines are very, very important to us. And all the different processes we go through, we have to identify sites. You alluded to, from Abby, you alluded to needing to identify sites. That has become a paramount issue in my day-to-day dealings. We contact approximately 100 sites in order to get 10 sites to participate. And I struggle every day to understand why. We go to investigators, primary investigators who have worked with us in the past. We get a myriad of responses back. I have competing studies. I don't have the staff. We don't have the patient population. And this is an acute trial that we're recruiting for. We're looking for sites. Yesterday I was checking emails and I was heartbroken to find that Metro Health here just declined participation. And for me, that means now spinal cord injury patients here in this area aren't going to have access to that clinical trial. And even sponsors, if they're only looking at 10 investigative sites, that means only 10 secluded areas around the nation are going to be able to offer it to spinal cord injured patients. But I don't know how we can help in that aspect, but it's educating. Does it start with school? Does it start with mentoring? My fear is that we have our A-listers of sites that we have worked with for many, many years, and a lot of those guys are retiring. And are they mentoring the next investigators that are going to run these clinical trials for us and that have a dynamic staff that understand research and have a good research department? So, is it other people we have to contact? I'm just using Metro Health as an example. So Dr. Smith declined participation. Isn't there somebody else isn't there another neurosurgeon here who would, love to run this clinical trial? We ask that question, but we usually come up empty-handed. So it's just a matter of participation. We need clinical trials to be carried out to the end. They need to get to fruition. They need to meet their enrollment goals in order to know. So many of the clinical trials fail because of slow enrollment, lack of enrollment, and the first process that takes so much time is just identifying sites that can do that for you, and then identifying the right sites, and then you work on enrollment. So that's my biggest headache.
Shelley, if you can hand it over to Lisa. Lisa, what can the community do in terms of capacity building?
So again, coming from a different perspective, not the basic science, I would say being a face to the commercial partners when we're looking at translating this technology, we need the SCI community to be at the forefront with these commercial partners to say, this is important, we value this, we need this. It's one thing for us as researchers to go out and say, hey, we really want, you know, this is a great thing for you to invest in, but it means a whole lot more coming from the SCI community, someone who can really value and point out all of the reasons why this is so important. So I think that would be the biggest thing for me.
Okay. And Matthew.
What it sounds like, what I keep hearing and keeps running through my mind is we need better and more effective relationships at every transition point along the pipeline. And what that really means is we need relationship builders. I was thinking a few minutes ago, when I was about 19, I was a bartender at a restaurant that had a banquet room, and once a month was Parents Without Partners. And it was the worst gig ever. It was a lot of sad, lonely, desperate people would gather and drink for a few hours in a dark banquet room. And that wasn't the problem. Like, they all came to the room. They all wanted relationship. The problem was there were very few relationship builders. And, you know, and I guess in some ways these people failed at relationships. So this lends itself to, like, this isn't going to work out very well. It's a really depressing shift every month. And so I bring that up because I think what we really need are strategies, efforts, mechanisms to build those relationships. What strikes me earlier in the conversation when you were talking about, like, sort of the walking and in studies, you know, mobility. Part of the issue here is that we have these clashing dogmas. Those are paradigms. They're systems that are built in, they're baked into the way you do your science. And they have formed, but they need to be rattled now and again, right? Part of that rattling about mobility, and even with epidural stimulation and the hype, should come from the community, and in some ways did come from the community. But it's also this dogma of, well, in order to get those autonomic functions, you got to do the mobility. Really? Is that, I mean, what? I know, but was it a kind of dogma? Oh, I would beg to, I've heard that from scientists. I've heard it from scientists. Well,
there's not
anyway,
a lot of understanding of that, but your point,
whatever
Matthew,
the origin of it, the point being
point,
that
Matthew.
those dogmas need to clash, and I think the injection of the community and as being a part of the process of relationship building, so those relationships are effective, because just because somebody comes to your lab doesn't mean it's going to work, and just because you come to visit my community doesn't mean it's going to work. We have to bring some tools. And, you know, and in part, like in a small way, and I'm not hyping what we've done, but you two are going to come to a meeting soon because we isolated some money in this state to fund research. And you're going to meet with people who have spinal cord injuries who don't know much about science, and clinicians from various institutions to talk about how we're going to fund some research in this state. Those are sort of relationship building tools in my mind that are not about each particular thing, money or funding science or how it's going to be structured. It's about creating some tools to create effective relationships. And so I think that's really, really important.
Thanks, Matthew. And then one more comment from Jane, and then we'll wrap this up. Yep, Jane, right behind you.
So to Matthew's point, I would say to build relationships, we still need to have a better understanding of each other in each group and what our challenges are, you know, I come from a nurse background. I have a little bit of knowledge of each of these segments, but not complete knowledge of every challenge. And so for us to really move forward, I think we need to really know what each group is up against. Like just earlier, one of the comments up above about participating in clinical trials, somebody wrote the clinical coordinator didn't have any enthusiasm. So right away I say, well, I don't know what she means by enthusiasm, but did the person not promote the research because they're not really able to encourage you to be in research? So is it just a misunderstanding of what each person is dealing with, each guideline that each person is dealing with? So just think we need a better understanding of all those things.
That's a good way to wrap it up, Jane. Thank you. So it's more of not just us trying to embed our community into each stage of the process and help educate people of what that means on each stage, but really us taking a look at the research enterprise or the research organizations and try to figure out what are your key needs so we can make sure we train the right people to make sure that we're placed in the right way and we're making sure that we're connecting the dots along the way as well. So good discussion. Thank you for all the ideas. Please, round of applause for our panel members. Thanks, guys.